Fabulous. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Super excited to have everyone here for the Equity Summit 2021. I am your moderator for this panel, where today we're going to talk about economic justice and the communities of color. I'm Dr. Befrida Jackson, and I'm with an esteemed panel, and I thank you so much for being here. I'm going to take a few moments out to just do some quick introductions, and then I please ask for you to share. This is a phenomenal topic. And when we talk about economic justice, there's so many variables. We can talk about wealth, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about unemployment. But I so look forward to hearing what you want to share and can share about your respective jurisdictions. You all are subject matter experts, of course, in your varied roles. So I'll start off with Mr. Chevron Jones. He's a state senator with the 35th District in Miami Gardens, Florida. We also have Senator Ramesh Akbari. She's a member of the Tennessee General Assembly, representing the 29th District of the Tennessee General Assembly. And we have Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. He too is a state representative at the 181st District in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania. So beginning with Mr. Chevron Jones, your introduction, please, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, and I'm so happy to be on this with two of my close friends who I have gotten to love over the last year and a half, and so I'm just happy that we are actually be able to be here on this topic today. I'm Senator Chevron Jones, and I have the awesome privilege of representing the 35th Senate District in Florida, which is the largest Black district in the state of Florida and the third largest in the country. I am privileged to represent Senate District 35. I was a graduate of Florida A&M University. Although I didn't do political science, I'm a science major, and people always ask me, how do I connect the two? I connect the two because I'm very strategic in how I look at issues, especially when it comes to economic justice within our communities. And I am looking forward to us not just talking about this, but also gaining knowledge from what's happening in Pennsylvania and in Tennessee and other places to see how we can collectively work together to bring justice, economic justice to our communities. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir. And Senator Ramesh Akbari, let's go to you next. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And again, like Senator Jones, I think that's the first time I've ever said that. Like Senator Jones said, I'm so excited about being with these two dynamic gentlemen. It is my pleasure to, sorry, I have fur babies. I apologize. It is my pleasure to serve Memphis and Shelby County. Memphis has the highest African-American population in the entire state of Tennessee. I represent about 170,000 people. Prior to serving in the Senate, I was in the House for 5 years. I was talking to my staff the other day, and I'm like, I want y'all to understand my motivation for being in office. That is to reduce poverty in this state. That is because why I focus on educational reform, economic development, and criminal justice reform. And if I'm not actually there making a difference, then I feel like I can go on home. So that's my motivation, and certainly consider it a privilege to be here with you all today. I'm looking forward to sharing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And lastly, Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, you, sir.
I just want to say good afternoon, everybody, and always a pleasure to just be in conversation with my friends and in conversation with three leaders, including yourself, Dr. Jackson, who understand how imperative it is to address what I call the moral and economic issue of our time. And Senator Akbari touched on it, reducing poverty. Poverty is a choice. It's a choice that we make in our economy. We do not have to have as many unhoused people all across the country as we have. We can make policy decisions that remedy that. We don't have to pay people the types of low wages that aren't attached to the dignity that is attached to the work that they do. We don't have to pay folks starvation level wages. It's a policy decision that we're making. And we don't have to be in a situation where the pandemic that we find ourselves in right now, COVID-19, where it exacerbates inequalities as it relates to health outcomes for Black folks well before we knew what this was. We don't have to have those disparities exist in perpetuity. They exist because we haven't, in all of our respective states, gotten a majority of our colleagues to really find the moral courage to act in a way that can change some of those outcomes. I represent the third poorest district in the Commonwealth. And so doing something about this issue, it's not hypothetical or philosophical for me. I have the great privilege of representing where I grew up. And so when I'm talking about families, I'm talking about my family, I'm talking about people who helped raise me, I'm talking about people in my neighborhood and communities who I really love. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for those wonderful introductions. We're going to have a conversation today. We've got a series of questions, of course, that we'll step through. But I think the primary takeaway that I've gotten from the three of you in your phenomenal introductions is that there's systemic racism, and that's very real. And there's a persistence of race gaps, and those race gaps, they manifest themselves differently as it relates to economic indicators. And so that's what we're going to hop into. So the first question, and I want to kind of pivot a little bit, and if you don't mind, ask the three of you a series of questions. The first of which is, what would you define, or how would you say the current state of economic justice? What does that look like relative to communities of color? First, macro, and then more micro, because I think speaking to your specific jurisdictions will be phenomenal for our audience to hear. So actually, Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, I'll go ahead and start with you, sir.
Yeah, I guess I'll just pick up where I sort of left off in the introduction, that what this really cruel COVID pandemic has done is exacerbate some of the larger trends that have tended to move really unabated. We know right now that when you look at indicators like home ownership as it relates to Black and Brown communities, those numbers remain stubbornly low. Home ownership is an important indicator when you talk about how we create the type of generational wealth that reduces poverty in the long term. As important as it is to raise the minimum wage and get folks out of these starvation level wages that they're in right now, you're not gonna be able to minimum wage job yourself out of the type of persistent generational poverty that has affected so many of our communities. And so, a big focus has to be wealth generation. And as we address some of these systemic issues that make it more difficult for people to generate wealth, like the inability to buy a home or the inability to have a job that gives you a steady income, we also have to look at some of the larger institutions that help perpetuate this. And so that means we need to have serious conversations about banks and lending for small businesses, for home loans, for auto loans, on and on. That means we need to have detailed conversations about how we get healthcare to everybody. Because right now, most Americans cannot manage an emergency medical bill and could send folks into poverty, having to respond to a critical emergency, health or otherwise. Here in Pennsylvania, part of what I've seen in my district, and this was a challenge, as I said, that preceded COVID, is that my district has been ground zero for the eviction crisis and the illegal eviction crisis. It's a part of the reason I've been focusing on legislation with my colleagues to ensure that every single person who is facing an eviction has actual legal representation. The numbers are really upside down when you look at how folks are currently dealing with housing in the eviction crisis right now. It's 9 out of 10 landlords have legal representation when they're taking somebody to court to evict them. Those numbers really just flip on their head when you look at renters who have legal representation. And so we have a lot of people who have either forfeited because they didn't understand their rights or been bullied out of their home. And so, obviously we have to deal with home ownership broadly, but also we have to deal with what's happening right now. A lot of people in my district who are renters and who are being displaced because they might have lost their job, but also because we have a housing system and a judicial system that enforces those housing rules that does not center working people and poor people.
Thank you, sir. That's definitely very, it's very telling. And I love to share that when we have these conversations, the empirical support is mission critical. And I think you brought to light kind of the reality of the empirical voice. And I have to share that, in 2016, 72% of white families own their homes. If we juxtapose that to 44% of Black families, now we did see a slight increase between 1983 and 2016 in terms of Latino family home ownership that increased by about 40%. but that's still far below what we see for whites. So just kind of bringing an empirical face to what you shared, Representative Kenyatta. Thank you so much. Now, Senator Akbari, what about you? What are your thoughts relative to the current state of economic justice as it specifically relates to communities of color? And share with us about your jurisdiction as well, please.
Well, I'll tell you, in my district has the National Civil Rights Museum, which is the very spot, the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. King was assassinated. Dr. King was in Memphis to help the sanitation workers who were those who worked, men who worked a full-time job, full week of work, and still qualified for different entitlement benefits. That was in 1968. 50 years later, in 2018, we celebrated or commemorated the assassination of Dr. King. And we found that those poverty wages were still being paid. These workers were still able to qualify for TANF benefits and for free health care. And Tennessee is one of the states that has not expanded Medicaid. So you literally have a population of working poor that does not have access to healthcare. And one of my colleagues actually said in a panel we sat on together that healthcare was a privilege. It was not a right. So I think when you have Tennessee is one of the states that is 46 in education spending. So when you create this system, we're one of the states where most states have had a decrease in their prison population. Tennessee has had a steady increase, but not a decrease in crime. So when you take all these factors together, combined with Memphis is a 67% Black city. However, the majority of our leadership is not Black. The majority of our CEOs and our nonprofit CEOs, they're not Black. There's very little opportunity. I think 1% of children who are born in poverty will make it out of poverty. And there's very little opportunity, we say in Tennessee, in Memphis, because we have FedEx and we have a tremendous distribution field because of the proximity to FedEx, that our children are not being trained to aspire higher. They're being trained to either be able to pack or push a box. And Tennessee is also one of the states that has not adopted a minimum wage. So our minimum wage is with the federal government. So $7.25 an hour, that's not enough money to raise a family. Even we look at, so Amazon has several distribution centers and everyone's super excited because they're paying $15 an hour with full benefits. But that's still not enough to raise a family and to pay for healthcare and to thrive and survive and to move from surviving to thriving. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about home ownership. For so long, wealth and wealth that can be inherited has been tied to home ownership. And when there have been systemic barriers from lending to even allowing people to buy in certain neighborhoods, to how property is valued based on a particular neighborhood, it puts people in a very difficult position where they're not passing along wealth, they're passing along debt. Where people have to, pass the hat around at church so we can pay for a funeral, or we have a GoFundMe account for that. So we have to acknowledge the problem. For far too long, there are folks who are elected officials and those in positions that can make a difference that don't even acknowledge that this is a very real problem, that there have been strategic things in place, from housing to payment to funding and education to disproportionate criminal justice laws, that have all worked together to keep a tremendous population in a certain level of poverty and I don't want to say subservient, but where there's not real power that's able to be obtained. Even if political power is obtained, true power is not obtained. So for me, that's very difficult. And I think anytime you have something like the Great Recession or you have the COVID-19 pandemic, that exacerbates these issues. You see Black folks being evicted in much higher numbers, and people of color in much higher numbers, losing their houses, losing their small businesses, not qualifying for certain relief from the federal government. So economic justice, it's one of those things that we have to get right, because if we don't, we cannot say that we are the great United States of America when other countries have better safety nets than we do. When we have no plan. We say the American dream, but for so many, there's no plan of upward mobility. It doesn't exist. And so I'm committed to that. I'm happy to be on here with my brothers in politics and in spirit, because That's what we have to focus on. If that's not corrected, if poverty is not addressed in a meaningful way, nothing will change. Crime won't go down, education won't get better, neighborhoods won't improve, nothing will get better.
Thank you so much, Senator Akbari. Senator Jones, yourself.
You don't want him. They gonna say everything. What you want me? But on a serious note, so often the our white brothers and sisters, they would counteract this conversation of economic justice and say that we do live in a just system. And yeah, and not sometimes. I know Senator Akbari and I know Representative Kenyatta. You know, we might say it different, but we counteract that to the point to where don't tell me that we live in this just system when you know the path to wealth is something that you deny me of, right? Whether that access to wealth is of home ownership, or whether that access to health is being able for an individual to get a job. If we look at what COVID has done, COVID has not just shined a light on the healthcare gaps within the Black community, but it has also shined a light on the economic gaps within the Black community. What do you mean, Chevron? Well, let's take a look at the unemployment rate. The unemployment, especially specifically in Florida, that the unemployment rate, the individuals who have been hit the hardest with this are individuals who look like those who live in Senate District 35. With that being said, the laws just do not match up to allow those individuals to get back on their feet fairly. How does that happen? It happened because, and this is nationally, if I get a mark on my credit report that I was evicted, now I am hindered from going out to getting another rental property. That is a cycle of not a just economic system. That is a constant barrier that we as a people have constantly fought against, and we're continuously fighting against. I mean, I filed legislation this year, just this month, to be able to fight against that, trying to fight and trying to break the barriers of this economic injustice system that we live in, right? But that also goes a step further. We also know that COVID has shined a light on the educational gap that we have within our community. How so? Don't tell me that virtual education is accessible for every child, but when I know for a fact that that is a barrier that does not allow children within Representative Kenyatta's district or Senator Akbari's district or in my district to be able to have this type of access to be able to learn. Because come June 21st, it has been proven by a Pew Research that there is and there will be a learning gap on June 21st. And kids who we're going to matriculate, will not be able to read. And we will continue to create this cycle to where this same conversation, this economic injustice system that we live in, constantly continues to move on. And now that economic injustice turns into the criminal justice system where these individuals now will go into. The last thing is this, and because all of this is dealing with economic justice in which we're talking about, the last thing is small businesses within our community. We're talking about access to wealth. And I know for a fact within my community, there is a large small business population. The many of them went when COVID came to ask for the PPP loans. The same banks who were bailed out by the federal government denied small businesses who look like you and I to be able to have access to them. You know what they told them to do? They told them to go to their local banks to be able to get it, knowing good and well that the interest rates would be higher for those individuals who have access to those loans. And so when we're talking about economic justice, it's not just from a local level. We have to make sure that we're not scared, and I see my brother do it all the time, calling out Washington, D.C. for what their Democrat and Republicans are like, letting them know that what you're doing, you're affecting the same people that you say you're fighting for. So in order for us to really genuinely say that we are dealing with economic injustice, make sure we're talking about how from 1990 to 2018, the Black community has not seen any increase within our communities when it comes to the wealth gap. And that's what we're talking about today. So I get worked up with this type of stuff because it is a true issue that we're dealing with, not just in Florida, but just nationally.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank all three of you. Those were excellent responses to really bring to light the fact that we're not talking about, I'd say the driver discussion is economics, right? But not in silos. When we talk about equity, we need to talk holistically, right? We need to talk about all of the variables that are infused into this formula of inequity, quite simply. And so, Senator Jones, you bringing to the fore about the wealth gap. Substantial. There's a phenomenal report that talks about the wealth racial divide, quite simply. And when we talk about the median Black family and what that number looks like, which is about 3,500. If you talk about the wealth of nearly 147,000, excuse me, for the white families, you see what gaps exist as it relates to this racial wealth divide. And that's mission critical when we really have this discussion about accruing, cultivating, maintaining, retaining wealth within communities. So I want to ask the three of you as we move forward with our questions, what do you find to be the three most significant barriers to economic justice in communities of color? I've heard, we've talked about employment, I heard poverty, health insurance, all of which are just huge barriers. But I'm curious to hear from the three of you, what would you identify as probably the three most prominent barriers? But then also piggybacking on the tail end of that conversation, what are some tangible solutions? We can be really good at saying, okay, this is the problem, but I want us to close out part of our discussion today about tangible solutions, things that are feasible, things that, our listeners, our audience can kind of take away and have a true conversation about, and perhaps where they are, some implementation, or at least the steps in that direction. So let me start actually with you, Senator Akbari.
Certainly. I would say access to capital. I think that that's a tremendous issue. I think it's something that has to be addressed. It is something that there's a reason why a lot of our businesses in Memphis in particular, we talk about this, that the majority of our Black-owned businesses only have one employee. They're not able to ramp up. And either your credit is not good enough, or your credit is fine, but you don't have enough time in business, or you don't have the proper mentors or networks to get that. So I think that's a big problem, number one. I think that we can solve that by having a lot more intentionality when it comes to MWBE grants, with specific emphasis on Black versus people of color, or versus a gender minority. We've seen that be a problem where a lot of white women are able to take advantage of different funding mechanisms, and Black folks are left out in the cold. And imploring our governments, whether state, local, or federal, not to just have kind of these window dressings to say, okay, well, yes, we have an Office of Diversity and we're going to do X, Y, Z. If you're not actually moving the needle forward. In Memphis, and I'll give you an example, at one point we had a Black county mayor, Black city mayor, majority Black school board, which the school board has $1 billion budget, okay? Majority Black delegation that went to the General Assembly, and a Black member of Congress. Spending with Black businesses went down, okay? So we have to look at ourselves as well when we hold these seats of power. What does that really mean? Number two, I would say education, and we kind of talked about this already. Access to education, focusing on artificial intelligence, preparing our kids and technology, preparing our kids for a world where they can actually function in the jobs of the future. So for me, and that takes funding, and it also takes, again, intentionality. I push legislation, and we're in the second phase of it, where it adds computer science to the curriculum starting in elementary school. So that's a part of the thought process and in the education of kids at that low of a level. And then I would say, again, just having, I would say that it has to do with healthcare as well. And I know I've said that a couple of times, but the reason why I say that is because I've seen where families are, one, the loss of income from a family because of different chronic conditions, or conditions like childhood asthma, where you have chronic absenteeism because of it, the missing of work, and also just the shortening of life and the expenses related to it. And for me, in our state, we could expand Medicaid. That would make a big difference. That would really change how people are able to approach their health, where it's something that can be preventative, as opposed to we have to rush to the emergency room for a basic health need. So those are the top three that I would say: funding, access to capital, and that funding also includes to be able to purchase houses. How can you qualify for a $50,000 car loan, but you can't qualify for a $100,000 house, which is much more stable, much more of an actual asset that generally doesn't depreciate but appreciates. So looking at all of that, and part of that also support for Black banks. This is something I'm pushing the state to do. We have 2 Black banks in the state of Tennessee, and there are billions of dollars in funds on a state level. Now, being able to put funds into those banks would help stabilize them so that they can offer additional tools to our communities. So being intentional is going to be really key. And stop with this window dressing. Stop throwing MWB out and diversity and inclusion, especially after everything that happened this summer. If I hear one more company talking about diversity and inclusion, I'm going to scream. Quite frankly, I feel like I should have gotten a different degree. A law degree was not it. But anyway, let's do something real. Let's do something tangible and stop with all these words. Words don't matter. Numbers do. Men lie, women lie, children lie, everybody lies, but numbers don't. So, and that, I'm quoting Yo Gotti on that one.
Thank you, Senator Akbari. The empirical picture, mission critical, as we've set the table here today. So Senator Jones, your thoughts, sir.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, Senator Akbari hit on one of them, and that is as far as representation in our legislative body. So it's the policies and the representation of those individuals who actually have a seat at the table. And listen, I want to make this extremely clear. Just because the person is Black does not mean that they represent our agenda. And that's what we're seeing quite often when we are going into these legislative bodies, or like people say, just because you my color don't mean you my kind. And I see in Black Caucus meetings all the time to ask you, are you really representing the people who you say you represent on legislation like this? But we also see that the policies that are coming outside of these legislative bodies and also from our municipal bodies, they do not help in the conversation with economic justice in which we're talking about. They actually are against, and they fight against being able for us to have that type of access to the wealth that so many of them have access to. It's also access to credit. We know that in the African American community, that because of various things, because some individuals have inherited debt from families and things like that, many of them do have a hard time getting back on their feet. And I've made it clear quite often that if we want to get the economy restarted, we need to reset credit scores. I really believe that being able to do that, resetting credit scores, now give people the opportunity to begin to be the true drivers in getting the economy back working within communities. The third thing I believe is employment opportunity for Black Americans in high needs but now I'm not just talking about saying that, because you have these Republican governors who will they will canvass the states and say our employment numbers are down, but are those high-paying positions that you're speaking of? That is the conversation we need to be having. What type of jobs do individuals have access to? So those are 3 things that I believe are important to as far as when it comes to barriers. But here's the thing that I believe is tangible of what we can do. We should be working more closely along with our community colleges, that they provide free financial literacy, not just to children, but to the parents, because the children can't learn what the parents don't know, right? And so a lot of parents, not as if they don't want to, it's that the parents don't have the access to be able to do it. And so we've worked along with Broward College to be able to share with communities how they can have access to this financial literacy, and in turn allowing their children to have access to that also. And the last thing I will say that's tangible that I think that Representative Akbari, she did tap on, and that is, how are we promoting our first-time homebuyer programs within our communities? It is something that the federal government has made it regularly available, but communities do a very bad job in advertising what that looks like. Some people see first-time home buyers programs, they don't know how to get access to that, or they don't even know where to start. And so if we could begin to make that more sexy again, I think that changes the conversation, and then it gives individuals the opportunity to be able to say, you know what, I can get access to this because it's made simple just for me.
Excellent. No, that's so very true. Thank you, Senator Jones, and Senator Kenyatta. We will close out with you. And I do a quick time check. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes, and we do have a very interesting question that I trust that we'll be able to get to before we close out. So Senator Kenyatta, your thoughts around those three most significant barriers and tangible solutions as well.
Yeah, so systematic racism, systematic racism, and systematic racism. I think this idea that we continue to have race neutral conversations about our public policy is really a fool's errand. So, we've heard, particularly my generation, grow up, go to college, it'll be great for you. Education is the key. When we talk about home ownership, we know that when it comes to educational credentials, Black women are running loops and circles around everybody in terms of attaining those credentials. That has not changed the fact that Black women are paid 50 something cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. And so we've talked about, housing and access to capital and small business ownership. Black women, again, in terms of small businesses, I haven't seen the statistics since COVID, but prior to COVID, Black women were the #1 group in terms of growing entrepreneurs, and yet access to capital, barriers to scaling up those small businesses stubbornly remain in place. What we need to understand as a country and as a Commonwealth here in Pennsylvania, that lifting up people who've historically been held down and marginalized benefits all of us. When we talk about the fact that Philadelphia is the #1 largest major city in terms of deep poverty, when I talk about my district being the third poorest district in the Commonwealth, what is the impact of that? Senator Abari talked before about folks who are working full-time jobs yet still are not making enough to qualify for TANF. The impact of that is a joint impact. When we don't have folks who have access to high quality healthcare and the emergency room becomes their doctor because maybe they have a healthcare card in their pocket, but they can't afford the deductible, they can't afford the co-pays. What is the impact of that? We all pay. And so this system that is unjust is a system that is a tax on all of us. And there's an added invisible tax on poor folks who have to go out of their communities to get access to basic goods and services, who have to go further to get a job that might have higher levels of wages, who have to go out of their way to get access to government grants, programs, and funding. And so this inability to right-size our economy is so upside down. It's so upside down. We only talk about recessions and talk about economic attrition when it affects folks who are already well off and well connected. When the banks start feeling it, now it's a crisis. But there's been a crisis that's ongoing in our communities every day of the week. And so when I watch TV and we're talking about, is the economy going up or down? It's Groundhog Day for folks in my community. The economy hasn't been moving at all in parts of our country. And so the impact of that is we have to start to understand that there is a direct connection to our continued out of sight, out of mind approach to folks who are on the lowest ends of our economic structure that impacts everybody else along that chain. It's a part of the reason, I've been talking so much about not only doing $2,000 checks, but looking at retroactive recurring checks. What is the impact of that? Folks who are low income, moderate income, that money goes directly into the economy. And so there's an economic boom that comes from us looking at these issues, certainly in the dollars and cents, but also looking at some of the intangible things that allow these inequities to persist, no matter who's in office, it seems, no matter what laws we pass, it seems, because still there is a systematic racism and discrimination that has made the PPP, I'll end with this note, that's made the PPP, the first go around, completely out of reach. I think it's 1.3% of Black-owned businesses got PPP. 40% of our Black-owned businesses may close forever because of COVID-19. That's not just because these Black entrepreneurs didn't know what the heck they were doing. It's because there is systematic racism that is embedded in our entire system. And until we uproot that, we are going to be in a cycle that continues over and over and over again, and we'll continue to spin our wheels.
Thank you so much, Representative Kenyatta. I think that's a phenomenal way for us to bring this conversation to a close. Although I feel like we could keep going. I think we've hit it all, and we are at time with about just 3 minutes left. But I want to thank our esteemed panel for today's conversation. It was interesting because the thought was to talk about economic justice, and entered COVID. Right? We talked about the pandemic-related economic crisis, and I know I heard from you, Senator Jones, about the school to prison pipeline. We can talk offline about that, because when you fold, education into this conversation, and I would be remiss if I actually said, wait, the preschool to prison pipeline, right? So the reality is there are so many variables that are part of this economic justice or injustice conversation. I want to close out because we've talked about the mission critical need of the empirical component, right? And we would be remiss yet again if the racial wealth divide piece. I think all of you have touched upon at the crux, that's macro what we're talking about, whether it's living through the lens of housing, employment, health insurance, retirement, multiple aspects. But the reality is that the median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median Black family, and 22 times more wealth than the median Latino family. I want us to close us with that point for just something to think on as we continue to take this information into our respective communities. And as you were saying, Senator Akbari, not just providing the lip service, but providing action steps, kind of real-time tangible solutions. So thank you all so very, very much. This has been an absolutely phenomenal conversation. We look forward to continuing the dialogue because the solutions, we're at present, we're doing our brain dump, trying to figure out kind of where best to go next. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Doctor.